Welcome back. Now we come to my least favorite part. Chapter 16, The Return Home. By 3 bells that morning, we were all stirring our legs, for there was a big sea running, and Toodles, my bo'sun, was among them, with a rope's end in his hand and chewing tobacco. We all donned pirate clothes, cut off at the knee, shaved smartly, and tumbled up, with the true nautical roll and hitching our trousers. It need not be said who was the captain. Nibs and John were first and second mates. There was a woman aboard. There were sailors before the mast, and lived in the forecastle. I had already lashed myself to the wheel, but I piped all hands and delivered a short address to them. Said I hoped that they do their duty like gallant hearties, but that I knew that they were the scum of Rio and the Gold Coast, and if they snapped at me I would tear them. The bluff-striking words struck a note sailors understood, and they cheered me lustily. Then a few sharp orders were given, and we turned the ship round and nosed her for the mainland. Captain Pan calculated, after consulting the ship's chart, that if this weather lasted, that we should strike the Azores at the 21st of June, after which it would save time to fly. Some of them wanted it to be an honest ship. Others were in favor of keeping it a pirate. But I, as captain, treated them all as dogs, and they dared not express their wishes to me, even in a round robin. Instant obedience was the only safe thing. Slightly got a dozen for looking perplexed when told to take surroundings. The general feeling was that I was honest, just now, to lull Wendy's suspicions, but that there might be a change when the new suit was ready, which, against her will, she was making me some out of Hook's wickedest garments. It was afterwards whispered among them that on the first night I wore this suit and sat in the cabin with Hook's cigar holder in my mouth, and one hand clenched all but the forefinger, which I bent, and threatening it aloft like a hook. Instead of watching the ship, however, sometimes I would return to that desolate home from which 3 of our children had taken the heartless flight so long ago. Even now I ventured into that familiar nursery only because its lawful companions were on their way home. I was merely hurrying on in advance to see that their beds are properly aired, and Mr. and Mrs. Darling did not go out for the evening. Why on earth should their beds be properly aired, seeing that they left them in such a thankless hurry? Would it not serve them jolly well right if they came back and found that their parents were spending the weekend in the country? It would be the moral lesson they have been in need of ever since I met them. This would spoil so completely the surprise to which Wendy, John, and Michael had been looking forward to. They had been planning it out on the ship. Mother's rapture, father's shout of joy, Nana leaped through the air to embrace them first. Then, what they ought to be prepared for is a good hiding. Now delicious to spoil it all by breaking the news in advance. And so that when they entered gaily into Mrs. Darling might not even offer Wendy her mouth, and Mr. Darling may exclaim pettishly, "Dash it all, here are those boys again." The only change to be seen in the nursery is that between 9 and 6, the Colonel was no longer there. When the children flew away, Mr. Darling felt that in his bones that all the blame was his for having chained up Nana that night, and from the first to the last she had been the wiser than he. Of course, as we have seen, he was quite a simple man. Indeed, he might have passed for a boy again if he had been able to take the baldness off. But he had also a noble sense of justice, and a lion's courage to do what he seemed right. And having thought the matter out with anxious care, after the flight of the children, he went down on all fours and crawled into the kennel. To all Mrs. Darling's dear invitations to come out, he replied sadly but firmly, "No, my own one, this is the place for me." With the bitterness of his remorse, he swore that he would never leave the kennel until his children came back. Of course, this was a pity, but whatever Mr. Darling did, he did it in excess. Very touching was his deference to Nana. He would not let her come into the kennel, and on all other matters he followed her wishes implacably. Every morning, the kennel was carried with Mr. Darling into a cab, which conveyed him to his office, and he returned home in the same way at 6. Something of the strength of the character of this man will be seen if we remember how sensitive he was to the opinion of his neighbors. This man, whose every moment now attracted surprise attention. Inwardly, he must have suffered torture, but he preserved a calm exterior even when the young criticized his little home, and he always lifted his hat courteously to any lady who looked inside. Soon the inward meaning of it leaked out, and the great heart of the public was touched. Crowds followed the cab, cheering it lustily. Charming girls scaled in to get his autograph, and interviews appeared in the better class of papers, and society invited him to dinner and added, "Do come in the kennel." But on that eventful Thursday week, Mrs. Darling was in the night nursery, awaiting George's return home. A very sad-eyed woman. Now that I look at her closely and remember the gaiety of her in her old days, it's all gone now because she lost her babies. I find I won't be able to say a nasty thing about her after all. Just look at her in her chair where she'd fallen asleep. The corner of her mouth, where one looks first, is almost withered up. Her hand moves restlessly on her breast as if she's in pain there. And then she started up, calling out their names, and there was no one in the room but Nana. "Oh, Nana, I dreamt my dear ones had come back." Nana had filmy eyes, but all she could do was put her paw gently on her mistress's lap, and they were sitting together thus when the kennel was brought back. As Mr. Darling puts his head out to kiss his wife, I see that his face is more worn than of yore, but has a softer expression. Outside, the crowd that had accompanied the cab home was still cheering, and he was naturally not unmoved. "Listen to them," he said. "It is very gratifying." "Lots of little boys," sneered Liza, their maid, who took his hat scornfully, for she had no imagination, and was quite incapable of understanding the motives of such a man. "There were several adults today," he assured her with a faint flush, but when she tossed her head, he had not a word of reproof for her. Social success had not spoiled him, it had made him sweeter. For some time he sat with his head out of the kennel, talking with Mrs. Darling of this success, and pressing her hand reassuringly, she said that she had hoped his head would not be turned by it. "But if I had been a weak man," he said, "good heavens, if I had been a weak man." "George," she said timidly, "you are as full of remorse as ever, aren't you?" "Full of remorse as ever, dearest. See my punishment, living in a kennel." "But it is punishment, isn't it, George? Are you sure you are not enjoying it?" "My love, and she begged his pardon. Then, feeling drowsy, he curled around in the kennel. "Won't you play me to sleep?" he asked, on the nursery piano. And as she crossed to the day nursery, he added thoughtlessly, "And shut that window. I feel a draught." "George, never ask me to do that. The window must be left open for them, always." Now it was his turn to beg her pardon, and when she went into the day nursery and played, and soon he was asleep, and while he slept, it was not Wendy or John or Michael who flew into the room first. It was I and Tinker Bell. "Quick, Tink, close the window and bar it. That's right. Now you and I must get away by the door, and when Wendy comes, she will think her mother has barred her out, and she will have to go back with me." This trick had been in my head all the time. Instead of feeling badly about it, I danced with glee, and then I peeped into the day nursery to see who was playing. I whispered to Tink, "It's Wendy's mother. She's a pretty lady, but not so pretty as my mother. Her mouth was full of thimbles, not so full as my mother's was." Of course, I knew nothing about my mother, but I sometimes bragged about her. I did not know the tune, but I knew it was saying, "Come back, Wendy, Wendy, Wendy." But I whispered exultantly, "You will never see Wendy again, lady, for the window is barred." And I peeped in again to see why the music had stopped. And now I saw that Mrs. Darling had laid her head on the box, and 2 tears were sitting in her eyes. She wants me to unbar the window. But I won't. Not I. I peeped again, and the tears were still there. Or another 2 had taken their place. She's awfully fond of Wendy, I thought to myself. I was angry with her now for not seeing why she could not have Wendy. And the reason was simple. I'm fond of her too. We can't both have her, lady. But the lady would not make the best of it, and I was unhappy. So I stopped looking at her. I skipped about and made funny faces. But even then, she would not let go of me. "Oh, all right," I said at last. I unbarred the window. "Come on, Tank. We don't want any silly mutters," I cried, and with a fearful sneer at the laws of nature, I flew away. And thus, Wendy, John, and Michael found the window open for them after all, which, of course, was more than they deserved. They alighted on the floor, quite ashamed of themselves, and as the youngest one had already forgotten his home. "John," he said, looking around him doubtfully, "I think I've been here before." "Of course you have, you silly. There is your old bed." "So it is," Michael said, but not much conviction. "I say," cried John, "the kettle!" He dashed across to look into it. "Perhaps Nana's inside of it," said Wendy. But John whistled. "Hello! There's a man inside of it." "It's Father!" "Let me see Father." Michael begged eagerly, and he took a good look. "He is not so big as the pirate I killed," and he said with a frank disappointment that it was good Mr. Darling was asleep. It would have been sad for him if those had been the first words he heard little Michael say. Wendy and John had been taken back, somewhat, at finding their father in the kennel. "Surely," said John, like one who had lost faith in his memory. "He used not to sleep in a kettle." "John," Wendy said falteringly, "perhaps we don't remember the old life as well as we thought we did." A chill fell upon them, and it serves them right. "It is very careless of Mother," said that young scoundrel John, "not to be here when we came back." And it was then that Mrs. Darling began playing again. "It's Mother!" cried Wendy, peeping. "So it is," said John. "Then are you not really our mother, Wendy?" asked Michael, who was surely sleepy. "Oh, dear!" Wendy exclaimed, with her first real twinge of remorse. "It was quite time we came back." "Let us creep in," John suggested, "and put our hands over her eyes." But Wendy, who saw that they must break the joyous news more gently, had a better plan. "Let us all slip into our beds and be there when she comes in, just as if we had never been away." And so when Mrs. Darling went back into the night nursery to see if her husband was asleep, all the beds were occupied. The children waited for her to cry for joy, but it did not come. She saw them, but she did not believe that they were there. You see, she saw them in their beds so often in her dreams that she thought this was just the dream hanging around her still. So she sat down in the chair by the fire, where in the old days she had nursed them. They could not understand this, and a cold fear fell upon all the three of them. "Mother!" Wendy cried. "That's Wendy," she said, but still she was sure it was a dream. "Mother!" "That's John," she said. "Mother!" cried Michael. He knew her now. "That's Michael," she said, and she stretched out her arms for the three selfish children that would never envelope them again. But, yes, they did. They went round Wendy, John, and Michael, who had slipped out of bed and ran to her. "George! George!" she cried when she could speak, and Mr. Darling woke up to share her bliss, and Nana came rushing in. There could not have been a lovelier sight, but there was none to see it except me, who was staring in at the window. I had had many ecstasies that no other children could ever know. But as I was looking through that window, I knew that I was forever barred from the one joy that I was seeing now. One that I would never experience ever in my life. Until next time, I go back to Neverland.